Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy and Organizational Behavior Management for the ABA Practitioner, featuring Dr. Todd Ward. My name is Kara Graham, and I will be your moderator for today's presentation. This presentation is presented in partnership with the New Jersey Association for Behavior Analysis and Autism New Jersey. This is just a reminder, if you are a member of NJABA, please take a look at our work groups and consider joining. We have work groups in several different areas, including public school, early intervention, adult services, insurance, and business practices. Today's presentation is being presented as part of the NJABA Business Practices Work Group. I want to inform everyone that today's presentation is eligible for Type 3 CEs, which is for non-authorized events. So you will not be receiving any type of certificate from NJABA. Required documentation for Type 3 CEs is an attestation signed and dated by the certificant. Today's presentation will be approximately an hour, and we will leave time at the end for Q&A. You will be able to submit questions during the presentation, and then Dr. Ward will take some time at the end to answer them. Dr. Ward is the president and founder of BCI21 Media, LLC. BCI21 Media aims to disseminate behavior analysis to the world and to support ABA companies around the globe through the Behavioral Science in the 21st Century blog and its subsidiary services. He is also the founder of Divergent Startups, which helps the public find their freedom through entrepreneurship. Dr. Ward received his Ph.D. in behavior analysis from the University of Nevada, Reno. He has served as a guest associate editor of the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management and as an editorial board member of Behavior and Social Issues. Dr. Ward has also provided ABA services to children and adults with various developmental disabilities, and previously served as faculty director of Behavior Analysis Online at the University of North Texas. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ward.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to present today. So what I'm going to talk about today has been a long-standing interest of mine, and I was involved, one of my main areas of focus has been organizational behavior management. I'm going back many years, working with Dr. Homenfar, and we're also involved in a number of projects related to ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or sometimes it's called ACT Training, Acceptance and Commitment Training, which is sort of a name people have given ACT when they're applying it outside of clinical settings and in organizational settings. So the purpose of my talk today is to give you a working knowledge of how elements of OBM and ACT can apply to your ABA agency. In my role of president of BCI21 Media, I have people contacting me all the time about how they can get involved in OBM, for example, and there's also a lot of interest in ACT too. But everyone, I feel like when I was in the clinical ABA world, I was doing OBM most of the time. You're doing OBM when you're supervising your frontline staff, and if you're working in an ABA agency, that is an organization. And so knowledge of OBM is particularly useful for you in that setting, and what ACT can add to it are elements that are specifically related to there's some high turnover in the human service type jobs, and ABA is definitely included in that. And so some ACT elements can definitely help to transform the stimulus functions of otherwise aversive events and to help you and your staff sort of persist through those times towards valued directions. I also just wanted to mention that this isn't really a research-based talk, so it's not filled with a bunch of citations throughout the paper, and the goal here is not to give an exhaustive overview of the research literature, but I will definitely give you some recommended readings at the end, and you can certainly email me later as well. Also, this isn't an exhaustive overview of OBM and ACT. That's really not the purpose here. And hopefully this presentation will spark your interest enough to start an initiative at your own agency, and I can also provide you with additional references and resources to help make that a reality. So a brief outline here. This is actually going to be slightly modified because this is I've given this talk a few different times at conferences and at keynotes before. So some of the interactive part is going to be slightly modified here, but I'm going to give an overview of OBM, Organizational Behavior Management, and specifically we're going to be starting by taking the broad view, so looking at your organization as a behavioral system. And then we're going to look at a concept known as the meta-contingency. And then we will go dive down more to the level of the individual performer and look at a nice tool that is actually free and publicly available called the Performance Diagnostic Checklist. And this specific version is made specifically for human service agencies. And there has definitely been some research in JOBM validating this tool. And then the next section, just smaller section, but we'll talk about ACT a little bit. We'll talk about what it is and how it relates to OBM and what I feel it can contribute to it. And I'll give a brief overview of 3 studies that I have been involved in and my lab back in Reno was involved in that all relate around developing online staff training modules that incorporate elements of ACT and applying them both to work settings and school settings. So two of those related to staff performance and one actually related to academic performance in a university. And then we'll wrap up by putting the pieces all together. So a little bit about me. I got my PhD from UNR in 2013, and I've done a lot of different things before and over the years. I was developing my own media company on the side, and fast forward to today. It's now the largest ABA media company in the world, and a lot of what we do, one way that I am incorporating ACT and OBM into my own work these days is through entrepreneurial consulting and to help people create businesses that do not currently exist in order to disseminate and diversify the field and ultimately create new jobs and help individuals follow their valued directions through entrepreneurship. I wanted to start off a little bit by talking about misconceptions of OBM, because in my experience, there has been some. One is this idea that OBM is some sort of corporate job and you have to sort of put on a suit and tie every day and go work for a Fortune 500 company or something like that. And that's simply not the case. You can do OBM wherever there is an organization, and in particular at your ABA agency. There's also a misconception that OBM is strictly for quote or unquote business settings, which isn't quite accurate. It can also be used in settings such as schools, and even in academia, for example, to manage the performance of students. We'll touch on some of that as well. And actually, one of the studies, my dissertation focused on teams with applications to the military and first responders and things like that. So you can sort of expand your conceptualization of what an organization is. There's lots of different types, and some of them could be thought of strictly in business terms. Third, there's a misconception that OBM is the same as business, and it's really not. Business, and for particularly those of you who are business owners, I'm sure some of you attending right now own ABA service provider agencies, and there is a lot more to business than OBM. You can sort of think of OBM as managing the performance of your staff and leaders within your company, but business also includes a lot of other things in there, such as the whole financial aspect of a business is a very big one. There's lots of legal aspects that OBM doesn't really touch on. But OBM is definitely useful for managing performance in a business. So anytime that you find yourself managing the behavior of other people, that is the situation under which you can use OBM, or you're doing OBM. So most of you are working in clinical ABA settings in the typical BCBA job. You know, you're managing your caseload. I did that for a number of years as well. And when you go and supervise your frontline staff and how they're working with your client and you give them feedback, that's OBM. So a lot of times I tell people from the clinical ABA world, you know, you're probably already doing OBM and you don't even realize it. You know, anytime you're giving performance feedback like that, you're really doing OBM. So directors and owners of agencies can practice OBM when managing their BCBAs or larger business operations. BCBAs can practice OBM when they're supervising their frontline staff. BCBAs can practice OBM when giving parent trainings. So this next section, we're going to sort of take the broader view of an organization, and there's sort of a sister field in OBM called Behavioral Systems Analysis. It takes the entire organization together as a system and looking at sets of interlocking contingencies or interlocking behavior in your organization and how they can create aggregate products or services and how that feeds back into the org as a system. So the first thing you need to think about is what are you producing as an organization? And for most of us in the ABA world, it's some type of service, right? So you can think of, you know, ask yourself the question of what is your aggregate service or what is your aggregate product? It's important to realize that just like the behavior of your clients that you're working with who may have autism or other developmental delays, your aggregate service is never a static entity. It's always changing along many different dimensions, just like the behavior of your clients. Your aggregate service should align with your mission statement. And if you don't currently have a mission statement, or if you cannot instantly say what your mission is as an organization, I would highly recommend that you work on that and or go through the business plan process, which is just a great exercise in getting clear about what your business is. And in my experience working with people who want to help them flesh out their business ideas and create their own company, not having or the ability to get clear on what your mission actually is can actually go a long way and impact many other aspects of your business as well. Your aggregate service also gives your company purpose. That's ultimately what your company is about, right? So if you have an autism service provider, your aggregate service relates to helping the lives of kids and families in some ways, and then you can take that and drill down more specifically. So just like performance, or just like the behavior of your clients, you can look at the outputs of your organization, both in terms of topography and function, or form and function, right? So topography, you're looking at what does your aggregate service actually look like? And just like behavior, you can look at different dimensions of your aggregate service. So here's a few examples to get you thinking. So one is, as a company, you can look at the number of cases that your company has overall. The number of cases per BCBA, so this is getting at caseload per BCBA. Number of hours your company is billing per week, or number of hours each BCBA is billing per week. The frequency with which your BCBAs are providing supervision, if that's once a week, once every other week, and for how many hours. What supervision actually looks like. Is it on-site supervision, or do your BCBAs have a caseload across a 100-mile radius, and do they supplement that sometimes with remote supervision? And depending on the answer, that can also impact other types of things relating to your service. the types of assessments or treatments used, the VB map, ABLS, AFLs, things like that. The degree to which your RBTs are adhering to their protocols is another dimension of the service that you're providing. And of course, those ever important soft skills, right? Those people skills of your frontline staff, especially if you're providing in-home ABA services, ensuring that your staff have those soft skills to be able to go into someone's house and get the parents and the child to like you really quickly is something that is relatively difficult to train, but is definitely a skill that's needed and can impact the topography or the form of your service. So just like form or topography, you can also look at how your aggregate service is actually functioning for your business and also in the larger marketplace. So if we're looking at functions, we're basically looking at how does your service relate to other people, or how do consumers respond to your service? So are they purchasing your service? Are they happy with your service? Are they making recommendations to others for your service? So there's a few different ways to measure this. And there's two overarching functions, really. One, of course, is to make money. If you don't make money, then you can't help, you can't improve lives of children and parents, and your business will fail. The other is to improve lives, right? And so to me, you need to keep both of them in mind. I think if you skew too far in either direction, you will sacrifice one or the other. So if you skew too far into the financial direction, you might be sacrificing quality of services. And that can take a variety of forms and lead to even some unethical situations that I have even personally experienced before. Sometimes that ethics code becomes a real safety net for you as a practitioner. If you skew too far in the other direction, though, wanting to improve lives of children and families while not being mindful of the financial aspects, then your business likely will not survive to help kids and families. So drilling down a little bit further, when you're looking at how your service is functioning for your business and marketplace, and if you're wanting to get measures on these things, you can of course look at revenue coming in, number of treatment goals met, that's how successful your services are being, a number of parent referrals, if parents are sort of organically telling their friends about you and you're getting more leads that way, number of parent complaints, if you have a frontline staff in a family's house and they don't have those soft skills and sort of weird situations develop. Social validity. So are you targeting things that the family finds valid in and of themselves? That's one of the most important things outlined by Beowulf and Risley in their landmark article. Okay. So I've given you a few ideas to think about. The big picture is what are your outputs as an organization as a whole, and some different ways to think about actually measuring those outputs if you're not measuring those already, to get a good idea of how your organization is functioning in the marketplace. Now we're going to sort of turn our sights internally to the business itself and to look at not only the performance of leaders and employees in your organization, but how all of that is interconnected to form work processes. And so here I'm drawing on the literature from Sigrid Glenn and also my past advisor, Ramona Homenfar, and I've been involved in that literature as well. And it relates to the meta-contingency, which originally came about in the 1980s, and then it has been steadily revised and refined over time into the present day, both for people in our field that are interested in larger social and cultural issues, but also there's a whole branch. People working in organizations in OBM have found the metacontingency to be particularly useful for thinking about work. So when you're looking inside your organization and your work processes, you can conceptualize almost any work process from the standpoint of IBCs or interlocked behavioral contingencies. So this is when the behavior or behavioral product of one person functions as the antecedent or consequence for the behavior of another, right? So if you write if you're giving a staff training, we'll just think about a generic staff training, for example. Your behavior as a trainer is interlocking with the behavior of people doing your training, or when you're interacting with your frontline staff and giving them supervision or feedback, your behavior is interlocking there. If you do an assessment and write up a treatment plan and submit it to your supervisor or to an insurance company, that's a product of your behavior that's interlocking with others as well. So IBCs, together, they form work processes that are ultimately connected to your aggregate product or service, right? And depending on how, I think a good role of a leader is to have those measures in place of how your aggregate product or service is functioning and what it looks like, and being able to take that data and feed it back into your organization and modify your IBCs as needed to ensure you're fulfilling your mission. So you can look at your agency and think to yourself, what are the most important IBCs or work processes in your agency? And I've come up with a few for you to think about. One of the most important is those related to insurance and billing. And this, of course, varies from state to state. Some states, like here in Texas, it's mainly private insurance. Other states are linked to Medicaid and other types of things. And of course, insurance companies, if you're billing through insurance, as all of you know, they have a lot of hoops that you have to jump through, and they sort of have an important role in outlining what your treatment plans look like, and they can definitely affect how your contingencies interlock. IBC is related to assessments and treatment plans. Typically, there's a group of people involved in the assessment and treatment plan process and a variety of levels in your organization. IBC is related to BCBA supervision. So at the very basic level, you have your BCBA behavior interlocking with your RBTs and your frontline staff. IBC is related to parents. Parents are, of course, a crucial part of treatment, and if you're not regularly meeting and interacting with parents, that can definitely affect the course of treatment. Staff training, of course, I already mentioned that. IBC is related to onboarding new employees in HR, which can sometimes be a very demanding process and can affect how your new employees come to perceive your company and its culture as well. Then you have driving and mileage. In my history, when I was doing in-home ABA, I was putting 400 to 500 miles on my vehicle every week, and that can definitely affect the extent to which the BCBA can interact effectively and manage their own caseload and all the people that are involved in those caseloads. IBC is related to marketing as well. Some of your agencies might even have a marketing department. And leadership and policy development. So oftentimes, in discussions of systems and metacontingencies, leadership is a crucial aspect of this whole thing, and policies that are developed by leaders can have enormous impact on the company culture and how people relate to one another and how their behavior interlocks and ultimately affects the aggregate service. Okay, so just like how behavior is nested in setting factors. If you look at your organization as a whole, it's the same thing. And in this literature, they call it the cultural organizational milieu. And this is very important to understand and be aware of, especially as a business owner. This is the larger antecedent environment in which your company operates, and that can impact your company in various ways. There is a very simple exercise you can do that's often embedded in business plans, and you can just Google it. It's very simple. It's called a SWOT analysis, SWOT, stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the opportunities and threats are things that are external to your organization. So these are things out there in larger society and the organizational milieu. And we'll look at some of those. Some of those relate to policies put out by the BACB, for example. You know, they're always revising their training requirements and their supervision requirements. The training that they have to go through to be able to supervise others, the RBT credential, those things are always changing, and those things have implications for how you allocate resources in your own company to revise your own internal trainings and things of that nature. Government policies is definitely one. Licensure is a huge one with lots of implications for how your business operates. And expanding that out a bit more, you know, depending on what state you're in, different states are more business friendly than others, and they have different regulations around taxation and other types of things that relate to the financial viability of your company. Insurance, of course. Business laws and taxes, I already kind of covered that. So insurance laws, you know, they're always being updated. School districts, if you work in school districts, you know, they're always sort of revising their policies and how they operate. Okay, so taking a, zooming out for a second to kind of give you a graphical depiction. There's a few different variations of the meta-contingency, but I think this one serves our purposes well for this presentation. So if you look at the top left, you see that box, and you see several different three-term contingencies in there, and they're staggered to illustrate that, you know, the behavior of someone in your organization can also function as an antecedent or consequence for the behavior of someone else. And then those interlocks taken broadly affect your aggregate service, right? And we have previously outlined different ways you can actually measure your service, both in terms of topography or function. And then, of course, your aggregate service is interacting with consumers in the marketplace. And that will ultimately affect the well-being of your organization, and that feeds back into your organization through leadership. And hopefully, if leaders are taking good data and monitoring their dashboard measures of their organization, they will modify their policies accordingly in an agile manner, such that they continue to fulfill their mission. And of course, all of this is nested inside of the cultural organizational milieu that we just mentioned. So when thinking about, this is sort of looking at some interlocks more specifically, and I actually created this once for a company that I worked at, which was an in-home ABA provider here in Texas. And what I wanted to do in this case is make an effort to start process mapping out some of the work processes and interlocks in that company. And so the blue circle at the top there, RCD, that stands for the Regional Clinical Director. And then those green circles are the BCBAs, and what those dashed arrows are representing is how communication flows between those roles. So the Regional Clinical Director, of course, is in communication with all of the BCBAs. They also facilitate communication between other BCBAs, and in this particular organization. The BCBAs themselves would also meet with one another through various weekly staff meetings and things like that. And then attached to the BCBAs are your frontline techs, of course. So each BCBA would be interacting with a tech, and each tech would be in a different house. And so this kind of breaks it down a little bit more, zooms in a little bit more to getting more at the individual level, and you can start seeing, you can start viewing your own organization from a process standpoint, and maybe start outlining or process mapping what the interlocks in your own organization actually look like. And I think the main way that behavior interlocks is through communication, right? So to sum up this section, if you're looking to improve performance, I would suggest looking at the system first, the broader system, your organization as a whole. The performance of one person can affect the performance of many others in your organization, because many times it's all interconnected. In an organization, people depend on each other. You have to work together, generally speaking, to produce your aggregate service and be competitive in the market. You also need to look at, your organization as a system, it's just the larger environment in which performance is nested, right? It's those setting factors. It's a dynamic environment made up of behavior and behavioral products. You can even think of policies as products. It links performance to your aggregate service, how your aggregate service is functioning in the market, the processes that produce your aggregate service, and the larger cultural situation in which your organization is performing, which can also include things like your competition as well, which may be more or less relevant depending on where your funding comes from. Okay. So this next section is going to focus on, so we took the broad view for a second, and now we're going to zoom in a little bit and look at the individual level performance in your organization. And for those of you with some knowledge of OBM, whenever you're doing a performance improvement project, one of the first steps you take is to establish pinpoints. So there's this nice pinpointing checklist I won't spend too much time on, but I actually borrowed this from an article from Barbara Buckland that she published on one of my websites, and I'll give you the link to that at the end of this presentation. But I just thought it was a really nice way to think about pinpointing. So number one is to identify the overall business results or outcomes that you hope to improve. These are typically the most significant organizational-wide goals or objectives, sometimes also called key performance indicators. So as an example, your goal could be to retain satisfied patients and families. Some of this has some medical terminology, but you can easily translate it. Number two is pinpoint the results using objective metrics, right? So I'll just skip to the example here. For example, increase monthly patient retention from 65 to 90%, or score X number or better on a patient satisfaction survey. So your goal as an organization might be to retain BCBAs or frontlines. Number three is pinpoint the behaviors that produce this result. Okay, so in number two, you're pinpointing results that you want, and number three, you're pinpointing the behaviors that produce them. So as an example here, it could be having staff members accept all requests to help team members, have them accurately complete all patient paperwork and physically hand it to the next shift, or have staff members answer patient and family members' questions within 24 hours, and so on and so forth. So if you just kind of reiterate for a second, everything that I'm really talking about today has parallels in typical ABA and working with behavior of clients and other people, right? So all of you should be familiar with how to objectively define behavior and results, and here we're just extrapolating it to the organization. There's a nice acronym called Norms of Objectivity that relates to pinpointing. N means it's not an interpretation, right? So you want to objectively define your pinpoints, just as you would objectively define your targets in your treatment plan. It should be observable, publicly observable, right? So we're not after subjective interpretations. Should be reliable, right? So reliable means that if you give two different people a definition of what you're looking at, they should independently be able to interpret things a similar way, and also to do it over and over again in a similar way. Should definitely be measurable. That's of course one of our key characteristics in our field is measurement. I also gave you some ways earlier in which you can start measuring the big dashboard measures of your organization. And it should definitely be specific, right? So again, that should really not be too much of a surprise for this audience today. The more specific you can get in defining performance and outcomes, the more likely it will be that you'll be able to measure them accurately and actually improve them. All right, doing pretty good on time right now. I'm going to try to end at the 50-minute mark and leave it open for questions. So as we're sort of drilling down, we're transitioning from the system level to the performance level. There's a nice tool called the Performance Diagnostic Checklist. There's actually a couple of versions. This one is specifically for human service organizations. And what you can do is after you have your pinpoints, you can start interviewing staff, and you can put your pinpoint, your performance concern at the top. It has some very straightforward questions. And again, if you just Google Performance Diagnostic Checklist, you should be able to download it for free. So it says, answer the questions below about the employee's specific performance problem, not the employee in general. The problem should be operationalized as either an excess or deficit, and items with an asterisk should be answered only after the information is verified through direct observation. So it's fairly straightforward. It has about 20 items, and they're all grouped together into a few different categories. And the first category here relates to training, right? So number one is, has the employee received formal training on this particular task of concern? Number two is, can the employee accurately describe the target task and when it should be performed? Is there evidence that the employee has accurately completed the task in the past? And if the task needs to be completed quickly, can the employee perform it at the appropriate speed, right? So training, of course, is a very important component in giving your employees the skills and the underlying repertoire needed to perform well in your organization. Second category, task clarification and prompting. So the first one asks, has the employee been informed that he or she is expected to perform the task? Which also, so some of this touches on your do your employees actually have job descriptions? Do they know specifically what they should be doing in their role in your organization in the first place? And in my experience, that's not always the case. And sometimes people do not have job descriptions, and it can create a lot of ambiguity in the workplace, and the contingencies can become very muddied and convoluted as well. So number two is, can the employee state the purpose of the task? Is a job aid, such as a checklist or data sheet for completing the task, visibly located in the area? Is the employee ever verbally, textually, or electronically reminded to complete a task? Is the task being performed in an environment well suited for task completion? In other words, is the environment noisy or crowded, distracting? Those types of things. Third category relates to resources, materials, and processes. So are there a sufficient number of trained staff available in the program itself, right? oftentimes we have to support on other people to do our jobs. That's where the interlocks come in. If materials such as teaching stimuli, preferred items, things like that are required for task completion, are they readily available? Are they easy to find or nearby? If no materials are required, then move to question 5. Are materials necessary to complete the task well designed for their intended purpose? Are they well organized for their purpose? Can the task be completed without first completing other tasks? If not, outline those. So sometimes the tasks that we have to do is sort of are part of a larger behavioral chain, right? And we have to do certain things in a sequence. If you answered no above, are other employees responsible for completing any of the earlier tasks? If so, indicate them below. So that directly gets at those IBCs, those interlocking behavioral contingencies. And I think this is the last subsection here. This pertains to performance, consequences, effort, and completion. So is the employee ever directly monitored by a supervisor? And if so, indicate the frequency. Does the employee ever receive feedback about the performance? And if yes, indicate below. Let's see, does the employee ever see the effects of accurate task completion? If yes, how? Is the task simple, or does it involve a relatively low response effort? For example, sending an email might be a very low response effort, but coordinating with parents and driving 50 miles to someone's house to conduct a VB map is a little bit more response effort. Number 5, does the task generally take precedence over other potentially competing tasks? If not, indicate these competing tasks below. So of course, that could definitely become an issue as the caseload of your BCBAs get higher and higher and their schedules fill up. Suddenly you have a staff of BCBAs with lots of competing tasks and contingencies at hand. Okay, so those were all the questions. Hopefully it doesn't look too scary. They seem to be fairly straightforward, hopefully. And what the PDC does at the end is it actually gives you, depending on how people responded, it's a very simple coding process. And then it will actually tell you types of interventions, types of changes that you might want to make in your organization. And it also gives you literature from JOBM and other places that support those interventions. So just briefly, the instructions are each item scored as a no should be considered as an opportunity for intervention, with priority given to areas in which multiple items are endorsed. So these may be implemented concurrently or consecutively, with the latter being preferred for settings in which staff resources are limited. Sample interventions and illustrative literature citations for each area are provided below. So I think that's a really nice addition to the PDC. It really just helps I think a business owner transition from those 20 questions and transition nicely into, okay, what do I actually do with this information after it's coded, and sort of where do I go from here? And so this last section, I think, does that in a really nice way. And that's the final 5 questions there for coding. All right. So the last section, it's not nearly as long as the OBM section. I'm going to talk a little bit about ACT, briefly what it is, and a few studies I was involved in using ACT and blending it together with OBM to affect performance of staff and students. So ACT was developed over about the past 30 years, since the 80s, in conjunction with relational frame theory. And the idea here is that for most verbally sophisticated people, sometimes we can begin to act to behave in ways that actually are not the most productive and can actually be disconnected a bit from the relevant contingencies or the most important contingencies in our lives or in our work environment. So the main idea is to get your behavior to start tracking the important contingencies that are aligned with larger organizational or life values and goals. Okay. So where ACT fits in, I'm sort of going to skip some of the technical wording on the last slide. But taking the big picture for a second, I'm going to show, and I also believe that ACT elements can alter the functions of work conditions to give you a more committed workforce. So, I know in my own experience, I've seen a lot of things in the clinical world. I've seen people attempt to set their beds on fire inside of a house and all sorts of other things that are very aversive. I've been, kicked and punched by clients, and I'm sure many of you have too. And that can definitely affect staff turnover, for example. And oftentimes, what we've found is that through some simple values clarification and goal setting types of things, it can sort of transform the functions of those otherwise aversive events such that your staff can actually persist through those times, since they're actually serving larger life directions and organizational directions. Okay. So the first study we did was published in Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. Here we developed some online ACT training modules, and we're actually targeting college students at UNR. And if you're interested in the details, we also published a chapter in this book here put out by Jackie Pistorello, Mindfulness and Acceptance for Counseling College Students. And very briefly, we developed 1 to 2 hour fully automated modules with text, images, and audio. It walks students through a values clarification exercise, which prompted them to think about why they were in college to begin with. Sometimes students just go to college because their parents told them to, and things like that. So we prompted them to think about that and to connect it to larger life values. We use various metaphors. An important component of ACT is that you don't just want to tell people what to do, because that might evoke something called pliance, where they're just doing it because they're being compliant to you rather than tracking what's important to them. We also utilize SMART goals, which is a very popular type of goal setting in the literature with decades of research. That stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-oriented. And so in this case, they set their own academic goals that were then aligned with their larger academic values. And very briefly, we found that values plus goal setting groups significantly boosted their cumulative GPA the next semester. And they also significantly increased university retention, so they're less likely to drop out of the university after only having a 1 to 2 hour automated ACT module. We also found that goal setting alone had no effect compared to the control group. We then did a study using similar ACT modules in a residential provider that I was working at when I was in Reno. We're looking across a few different houses. Again, they got some automated online modules with values, perspective taking, and goal setting. The values and goals here were tied to their work at the company in this case. So why do you value working in this job? We're trying to link it to the mission of the company and to set goals that are aligned with those. We did a perspective taking exercise targeting getting them to take the perspective of their clients. They're mainly working with adults with language deficits, and so we had an exercise where, imagine you're in a foreign country and you can't speak the language, and, can you think of times when you might get aggressive or angry since you can't communicate with people, and things like that. basically the results we found is that both houses that had the values component actually increased staff turnover, which was unexpected. So we actually made it more likely that staff would leave. However, we ended up presenting this to the executives of the company, and we called this positive attrition. So what ended up happening is that staff actually voluntarily ended up moving on to other jobs. But what we said about that is that what you're left with is a more committed workforce, right? So if you can implement something like this at the point of hire, then it could sort of act as a self-selecting mechanism, where you might be hiring less, but the people you end up with at the end are more committed to the mission of your company, and they're more values aligned, which can, of course, prevent future issues and incident reports and things like that down the road. Okay, so I just mentioned that. So again, the thing about ACT is you're never telling people what they should value, right? So it's up to them to decide for themselves. So in the academic one, the students could have decided, you know what, I don't value a college education and I'm going to leave. But that didn't happen. In this study, though, some of our frontline staff at the residential provider did say, you know what, this actually, I don't really value this work very much, and I think I'm going to move on. Finally, for my dissertation, we combine ACT together with teams, highly dynamic teams. We were doing some work with the Navy and everything, and in this case, I brought in people to a basic lab and had them play Call of Duty for an hour or two, first-person shooter game. But it was a fun way to create a team of people, and we were measuring their communication, and we gave them ACT modules targeting teamwork and working with others that were very similar to the previous studies. And essentially what we found is that a group who had values plus perspective taking, to take the perspective of their other teammate, they ended up completing the most goals in the scenario. They were also the most consistent in completing their goals. However, they did not complete their goals the quickest. So they sort of slowed down a little bit. But in the end, they ended up being the most productive. And also, both the values plus perspective taking and perspective taking only groups saw significant decreases in their communication. So they became not only more productive, but they talked less. And the things that they were saying to each other were more relevant to the task at hand. So here you can even think about in your own ABA provider work situations, you might have teams that you're working with, and there could be situations where something like this could be beneficial. So wrapping up here, if you're thinking about applying ACT in your agency, I think I could do a whole nother hour-long presentation on ACT here, but I wanted to give you the systems framework and then give you a touch of ACT, give you some of show you a little bit of data and generally how it's used, and then how you could integrate that into your org as a behavioral system after you have those measures in place related to your service and the performance and the processes and interlocks of your organization. So values and ACT gives you direction. Skinner talked about values as well from a little bit different perspective. But values in this case are overarching life goals that you can never achieve. So for example, being a good parent, or if you value learning, or if you value helping kids with autism, you can always do that. And there's never a point where you can say, okay, I'm done doing that. I've done it all. You can always do it. You never want to tell people what to value, which can have unanticipated results. Oftentimes you use metaphors to convey them for that reason. And you can link a values exercise to the values and mission of your own company, and you can get people to think about your own company's culture and their values and mission, and prompt them to think about how they can link their own values and goals to those of your company, to generate a more committed workforce. And a training can take whatever form it needs to take, really. We did ours using brief online modules. They can definitely be done in person. And the content can be changed to fit whatever situation that you're looking at. And you saw 3 pretty diverse situations that I just showed you. Other processes can also be added in as needed as the situation dictates. For example, values-based goals were added to the academic study, but we left that out for teams. We didn't put in goal setting because it didn't make sense for that situation, though we did have perspective taking. Okay. And so here are some suggested readings. I believe everyone has a copy of my slides as a handout. But I have Buckland, I have a paper related to the performance diagnostic checklist, and some other resources related to meta-contingency and ACT as well, if you're interested in learning more about that. And please feel free to email me and reach out to me if you have any questions about anything I talked about in here, or how you could go about applying them in your own agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. That was great. We do have a couple of questions coming in. So if anybody has questions, please just submit them in the chat window, and we'll get started with the first couple. Dr. Ward, what books would you recommend for someone interested in OBM?
Well, the one I would naturally go to is by Aubrey Daniels, called Performance Management. They're either on their 5th or 6th edition now. And it's a very comprehensive textbook that will give you a very solid foundation in OBM, and it has a really nice emphasis on how to use ABA methodology and time series designs in an organizational environment, and how to create measures of performance and pinpoints and all of that. So that's definitely one of the first places I would go to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me see if there's any other questions here. Just a question about, yes, this is going to be available as a recording. So the presentation is being recorded and will be available. Another question is, what are some examples of values exercises to use at the interview stage of hiring for TAs and teachers in special education classes?
That's a great question. So I sort of resisted the urge to go into nitty-gritty details on that for the sake of time, but generally what we ended up doing, and a lot of this is derived from the ACT, like the original ACT book written, I think it was written in '99, and they have an updated version now. In those exercises, what we did is we talked about a particular domain. So in the academic one, we talked about going to college, and gave some multiple examples of how when you're behaving at college, how you could or could not be tracking your own values. And then at the end, we prompted people to take a few minutes to think about their own values as it related to a college education. And I think a critical component there is to prompt them in a way where they are describing actions. So words like we used, try to use words that end in ing, for example. So I value learning, for example, or I value reading about new things and things like that. So it kind of clarifies that these are ongoing actions that you can always engage in. So when it comes down to it, and when you're actually prompting people to go through that, that is a critical component in and of itself when you're thinking about values as actions that you can take. Actions that you can take that you can never end doing, because you can always do them. So in an ABA setting, it might be helping kids acquire language skills, or caring for families, or things like that. Just to give you a few ideas off the top of my head.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question. Are there examples of the 1 to 2 hour ACT modules that have been utilized in your research? So are there examples somewhere that I guess attendees could find, either on the internet or if you have them to share? I guess so that if somebody was looking to make their own, they had like, a sample to kind of observe or view.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Thanks for the interest. So a few things about that. The actual modules themselves, I don't think actually exist anymore, that we used in particular. I might have some resources to share, some other materials to share if they're willing to email me. So the first step we would take in developing those modules is to develop a script, which was several pages. And then we would typically, for at least 2 out of the 3 studies that I mentioned, well, I think all of them, they had a narrated voice that was reading the script and would walk you through the entire exercise itself. So I should have some materials like that. You could also check out the original JCBS journal article related to the academic study that I just mentioned, and also that book chapter by Jackie Pistorello's book. Both of those go into much greater detail about the content of those.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me see, I have a couple more questions. Take time for one more. One question was, where can attendees find a PDF version of the Assessing Performance Issues checklist?
Is that the performance diagnostic checklist?
I think so. I think that's being referred to.
Okay. If you Google it, I don't have the specific URL at hand, but you should just be able to Google performance diagnostic checklist, and it should come right up for free. And you can also check out the reference that I have. I think my screen might still be up, by Carr and Wilder in 2016. It might be linked to that specific reference there. In fact, as I'm looking at it right now, I think that should be publicly available. So a quick Google search should bring it right up. If you can't find it, just send me an email. I like getting emails from interested people, and I can definitely give you a copy if you're having trouble finding it.
Great, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. I'll give another couple seconds. Anybody has anything else? Okay, I just want to repeat, we had a couple of questions about CEs, so I'm just going to repeat about the type 3 CEs. If you, in order to be eligible for type 3 CEs, this is a non-authorized event, which means that you're not going to receive a certificate, but you would document it yourself in your BCB portal. So I hope that answers any questions that anybody had about CEs. So if there's no other questions for Dr. Ward, I think we can wrap up today's presentation. Thank you again, Dr. Ward. This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.